To our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. We are in the 11th episode. In the 10th episode, we talked about research designs, different types of research designs that follow under quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. So in this episode, we will be talking about data collection. This is a very important topic in a research process, where we collect data that will be used to make a kind of analysis that will give us the meaning, will give us a kind of sense, will make sense in the analysis phase. So we'll start with the quantitative data analysis, and the first thing we'll look at the steps that you should take while conducting quantitative data collection. But this process of data collection in quantitative it's not a simple step. It's not just simply collecting data and you use them for analysis, but instead it involves a number of steps. The first step that we'll discuss is you have to decide on what participants you will use in your study. What participants you will use in your study. You don't just select any person to be used in your study, but instead you will have to decide what participants. After you have decided on which participants you will use in a study, then you will have to obtain permission from them. Then you identify the types of measures that you will use while answering your research questions. Then you will locate the instruments that you will use to collect data, and the last step, you will begin collecting data, where you will administer the data collection process so that you can collect data. So let's start by explaining the first step in this process of data collection, that what participants will you study. As you are asking yourself what participants you will study, you will also do several things. The first thing that you will do, you will have to identify what we call unity of analysis. Speaking of unity of analysis, things like who can supply the information that you will use to answer your quantitative research questions or hypotheses. So at this early stage in the data collection, you must decide the level. You must decide the level of which you will pick up who will be used to answer such research questions. Such level can fall under individual level or family level, organizational level, or even district level, and of which those data needs to be gathered. So that kind of level is what we call unity of analysis. That is what we call unity of analysis. So deciding to gather data from multiple level, or you can decide to gather data from one level, this kind of decision depends on the research questions or the hypothesis that you seek to answer. But also the data you measure can be independent variables or may differ from the unity, or they can be dependent variables. So the data that you decide to gather can be either dependent variables, or they can be from independent variables. So that is one step while you are you decide on the participants that you will use in your study. The second thing that you will do as you're deciding on participants, you will have to specify population and sample. You will have to specify populations and sample. In some situations, you will find yourself selecting individuals for your research, just basing on who volunteers to your study, who volunteers to participate in your study, or who is available. But in real sense, in a more advanced research process, you will have to select individuals or these organizations that are representative of the entire group of individuals or the entire group of organizations. Speaking of being representative, this refers to the selection of individuals from a sample of population such that you find such individuals that are selected are typical of the population under study, and that enables you to draw conclusions from the sample about the population as a whole. So you have a kind of representative individuals from a sample of population, and these individuals become typical of a population. We have different terms there. We have mentioned like population and sample. So let us talk about what is population and what is sample. Speaking of a population, population is a group of individuals who have the same characteristic, individuals with the same characteristic. For example, let's take of all students. All students can make up a population of students, or think of instructors at a certain university or different universities. So all instructors will make up a population of instructors. Think of software developers, then all developers will make up a population of developers. So a population is just a group of individuals but that have same characteristic. In practice, quantitative researchers, what they do, they sample from a list of the people that are available. They sample from a list of the people that are available, and in that case they have a kind of population that they target. Or speaking of a target population, or other books say call it sampling frame. This target population actually is a group of individuals or a group of organizations with some common defining characteristics that the researcher can identify and study. So sometimes you don't deal with the whole population, but you can have a kind of a population that you target. For example, speaking of all instructors, say you want to study about instructors at universities, then you can target, let's say, instructors who teach ICT courses. That can be your target population, and from that target population you can use it to draw your sample. So within this target population, then researchers, what they do, they select a sample for their study. So you can have a larger population that have common characteristic. Then from the larger population, you can target a certain people that are available for your study. From that target population, there is where you can draw, you can select a few that to represent the population. Then that is what we call a sample. So what's a sample? Sample is a kind of subgroup of the target population that the researcher plans to study, and for generalizing about the target population. So you plan to study a subgroup of the whole population, and you use that sample to generalize the target population. So in an ideal situation, you can select a sample of individuals who are representative of the entire population. So you can select the group of individuals who are representative of the entire population. So it's like this: you have your population in here, you have your population in here. Then from this population you take a subgroup of this, then you use to study this subgroup. This subgroup is what we will call a sample. But you can have this population that you target, the population that you target, then we call that kind of population is a target population. So sample is drawn from a target population. So as you are doing your sampling process, you can do using two different ways. You can use what we call probabilistic sampling, probability sampling, or non probability sampling. So we have a number of strategies for probability sampling and for non-probability sampling. So what researchers do, researchers select individuals from these population that are representative of that population. If that researcher does that, selecting individuals that are real representative of the population, then that is probability sampling. This kind of sampling that we call probability sampling is the most rigorous form of sampling in quantitative research, simply because what investigator does, investigator can claim that the sample is representative of the population, as such can make generalization to the population. So if you have equal chances of drawing data of or drawing participants from the larger population, and you can claim that the sample is actually representative, then that kind of strategy, those kind of strategies, they fall under a probability sampling. So there are a number of techniques, or there are a number of strategies that fall under a probabilistic sampling. We have one that is called the simple random sampling. This is the most popular and it's the most rigorous form of probability sampling from a population. Speaking of simple random sampling, researcher selects participants or selects units. For example, you can select organizations such as hospitals, let's say schools, to create a sample so that individuals have equal chances of being selected from the population. So you have different individuals that you want to include them in your study, but you give them equal chances. You give them equal chances of being selected. Here, the aim or the intent of this simple random sampling is to choose individuals to be sampled who will be representative of the population. So any bias in the population will be equally distributed among the people that have been chosen. So simply because you are using probability, that means each and every individual has equal chance of being selected. So the typical procedure used in simple random sampling is like this. You assign numbers to individuals, you give them numbers, or you give numbers to different sites in the population or whatever, and then you use a certain type of table, we call it random numbers table, to select individuals or to select sites for the sample. So that is what we call a simple random sampling. Simple random sampling. Another strategy or another technique in sampling, we call it systematic sampling. This is a slight variation of the simple random sampling procedure, but in this procedure, what you do is you choose every nth individual or a site in the population until you reach to your desired your desired sample size. Let's do this. For example, you have let's say you have this first individual, the second individual, third individual, fourth individual, fifth individual, sixth individual, and seventh individual. Let's say you select after every 2 individuals, you say you select that individual to be included in the study. So you say this is the first, you leave this first one, then you leave this second one, you select this one, then again you leave this one, you leave this one, again you select this one. So this is what we call systematic sampling. After every nth individual you select. So this nth is the matter of deciding. You can select, let's say, after 3 individuals, or you can select after 4 individuals, or you can select after 2 individuals, etc., etc. So that is a systematic sampling. Another sampling strategy is what we call a stratified sampling. In this type of sampling, researchers divide, or we say stratify, the population on some specific characteristics. For example, you can divide or you can stratify individuals as males and females. Then you use simple random sampling to each to select individuals from each stratum or select individuals from each groups. For example, let's have this. For example, we have two groups here. We call this group 1 will be for males, and this another group will be for females. Then these groups have individuals inside, and these other groups have individuals inside. Then from this group, then you use simple random sampling. Maybe you say you select 3 individuals from this and 3 individuals from that. So randomly you select 3 individuals from this first stratum, and you select another group from another stratum. So that is what we do when that's what we mean when we say stratified sampling. Stratified sampling guarantees that the sample that you will select or the sample that you will choose will include specific characteristics that a researcher wants to include in the study. For example, as we have grouped there two groups, males and females. If you use just a simple random, for example, you encounter a situation like this, that you have few females and many males. So there is possibility that if you use simple random sampling, there's a possibility your individuals or the participants that you will use in your study will all come from a male side. So if you want to guarantee yourself that the sample includes also females, then the best strategy will be stratified sampling. So stratification actually is used when a simple random sampling procedure would yield or would result into fewer participants in a specific category. For example, we have given there an example of females than what you need in your study. Another strategy we call it multi-stage cluster sampling. In multi-stage cluster sampling, the researcher chooses a sample in 2 or more stages, because either the researcher cannot easily identify the population or the population is extremely large. So if you have a larger population, then can give you an example here. If you have, let's say this is your population, then from this population you can select another a small sample population here, a cluster. Then from this again you can select another sample until you get your this being your last sample, or this become your last sample. So those are the strategic sampling from probability side. Let's speak about non-probability sampling. In non-probability sampling, researcher selects individuals because they are available, for example, or they are convenient, or they represent some characteristics that the investigator wants to identify. So in this case, we have two important strategies. One is convenience sampling, and the second one is snowballing. But there are other strategies like purposive sampling or volunteering sampling. Speaking of convenience sampling, what researcher does, researcher selects participants simply because they are willing and they are available to be studied. So you find some people that can assist you in your study, then they are available, then you use them. That kind of study, we call it convenience sampling. In this case, what the researcher does, the researcher cannot say for sure that he or she is confident that the individuals that he has used in his study are representative of the population, but the sample can provide some useful information that can be used to answer questions or the hypothesis that the researcher has. We have another sampling strategy under non-probability sampling, which we call it snowballing sampling. In snowballing, what researcher does is researcher asks participants to identify others to become members of the sample. So you go to one person and you ask him or her the questions that you want him to answer. Then after that, you ask him to recommend another person that can be included in your study. So after understanding sampling strategies, now we can move to talk about sample size. We can move to talk about sample size. When selecting participants for a study, it is very important to determine the size of the sample that you will need. You cannot use all of the population, so you need a particular size, a particular number of people that you will include, that you will extract data that will be used to answer your research questions. What's the general rule for this? The general rule of thumb for this is to select a larger sample as possible from the population. So we say that if you have a larger sample, then you will have less potential error, that the sample will be different from the population. You will have you will minimize the error uh, of differentiating the sample from the population. Then that difference between the sample estimate and the true population score, that is what we call sampling error. So to minimize sampling error, there is where you select a larger sample from the population. There are two ways. To determine the sample size. One way to is to determine the sample size by selecting sufficient number of participants for the statistical procedure you plan to use. This kind of means presumes that you have identified the statistic to be used in your analysis. For example, you can use experimental, let's say, design, or you can use a correlation design, or you can use a survey. So as a rough estimate, if you are using, let's say, experimental design, then you can decide to approximately use let's say not less than 15 participants in each group in your experiment. If you are talking about people, let's say you want to do a study in education or educational studies, for example, you need to take at least 15 participants in each group if you are using experiment. So you can use, if you are using correlation study and you want to see how variables relate, then at least you have 30 participants for correlational studies and 350 individuals for a survey study. But this size vary depending on some factors. This size can vary depending on different factors. Another thing that we can use, or another way or another means of extracting a sample size, is to use a sample size formula. Sample size formula provides means for calculating the size of your sample based on several factors. Using formula takes out that guesswork. It takes out that guesswork of determining the number of individuals in the study. And in that case, it provides a precise estimate of your sample size. There are different formulas that you can use to calculate your sample size. And these formulas are different. They are found in different books, or you can search them online, and you will find a lot of formulas that you can use to calculate your sample size. We are still in the process of data collection. We are still in the process of quantitative data collection, and the first step of determining the participants that we can use in our study, we have closed that chapter. Now we are in the second step, which is you have to obtain permission. After you have identified and you have collected your participants for your study, then the next thing that you need to do is to obtain their permission to be studied. You have to obtain their permission to be studied. There are different types of permissions that you need to use so that uh, you can get go ahead for you uh, to obtain data from such people. Uh, you can get permission from different institutions as institutions, organizations, or you can get permissions from different sites. For example, you go to a secondary school and you ask for permission to conduct your research, or you can ask permissions from the individuals themselves, so the participants or the group of participants. After you have obtained your information with the identification of the participants and the procedure that you have followed to gain permission, then the next thing you have to turn to specific forms of data that will help you to answer your research questions or address your hypothesis. So this is the third step that we call information to be collected. So there are a number of steps that you should follow as you decide on what information to be collected. The first step, you have to identify variables in your research questions or in your hypothesis. The second step, you have to find definitions of those variables, and then you consider the types of information that will help you to assess these variables. In the identification of variables, what you need to do, the first thing you have to do is you have to specify those variables from the research questions. Uh, in the research questions, if you look at the research questions or the hypothesis, these statements contain variables. So to determine what data need to be collected, then you need to identify clearly the variables in your study, and those variables can be seen in the research questions. For example, you had this kind of an objective. Let's say you want to find out factors affecting a performance of a student. Here you have two variables. You have factors and you have a performance of a student. So having these variables, then you have to identify whether they are independent variables or they are dependent variables or they are control variables. For example, in this one we say factors affecting performance of student, then we see that performance of student can be affected by certain factors. So if that performance is the one that is influenced, then we call it a dependent variable, and these factors will be independent variables. So in the identification of variables, you have to specify those variables from your research questions or from your objectives or from your hypothesis. A useful strategy to do this is to make a list of variables so that you can determine what variables are operating in a study. So that is the first step. The second step in the identification of variables, you have to operationally define each variable. You have to state what each variable mean. Operational definition, what means by operational definition is the specification of how you will define and measure the variable in your study. For example, you say variable called age. Then age, you put a kind of explanation what age means. Age, let's say, is the age of a participant, and you say this will be a whole one number that you get from your participant. Then again, in the identification of variables, you choose types of data and measures. Types of data and measures. You identify the type of data that you will measure. That will measure your variables. Researchers collect data on instruments. That is what we know. Researchers collect data on instruments. Speaking of instruments, instrument is a tool for measuring, is a tool for observing, or is a tool for documenting quantitative data. An instrument can be, let's say, a test. You can give test to your participants to see some some types of information from them. You can give them a questionnaire. Also, a questionnaire is also an instrument. You can give them a tally sheet. You can give them, or you can use an observational checklist and check as you are observing. So in quantitative research, there are four major types of information that you can gather. There are four major types of information that you can gather from your participants. The first type of information that you can measure the first type of information that you can measure is the performance measure. In performance measure, you assess an individual's ability to perform on something that you intend to test. For example, you measure their interest, you measure the scores, you measure their intelligence, etc. So that kind of measures, we call them performance measures. You can have what we call attitudinal measure. This is very popular for studies such as surveys, correlation, and experiments. You measure attitudes of individuals that we call attitudinal measures. We have another type of measure, a type of information that we collect from individuals, behavioral observations. You observe the behaviors of your participants, then you record them. Some other information that can be collected, factual information. This consists of some numerical individual data that are available in public. For example, the grade reports of individual, the attendance records, etc., etc. The next step in the process of data collection, you will have to decide on what instrument you will use to collect data. Here you have three options to get instrument. As we have said there, instruments can be, let's say, questionnaire, can be a test, can be a tally sheet, or you can use observational checklists. There are different options that you can use to obtain such instruments. You can either develop one instrument by yourself, or you can locate one instrument and modify it and use it in your study, or you can use an instrument in its entirety. You take an instrument from another individual and use it. But if you take an instrument from another person and modify it, modifying instruments, this means you have to locate an existing instrument and you have to obtain information to change it, and you have to obtain information to make changes in it so that it can fit your requirements. So if you are using an instrument, if you have located an instrument and you are using an instrument that is developed by another researcher, you want to select an instrument that reports individual scores that are reliable and valid. So validity and reliability are important concepts that you have to consider while you locate and modify, or locate and use instruments from other individuals in their territory. So speaking of reliability means the scores from an instrument are stable and consistent. In this case, scores should be nearly the same when researchers administer the instrument multiple times at different times. So if you take an instrument, you give it to individuals, the answers that they give should be consistent at different times. Also, these scores need to be consistent. When an individual answers, let's say, a certain question in one way, then the individual should consistently answer closely related questions in the same way. That is what we call reliability. Reliability means the scores from the instruments should be stable and should be consistent. How about validity? Validity means the development of sound evidence to demonstrate that these tests interpretation match its proposed use. For example, the scores about a certain concept, the scores about certain construct that the test is assumed to measure should match the proposed use. Now, as we are finalizing our episode, let's talk about scales of measurements. Actually, scales of measurements are response options to questions or to research questions that measure or observe variables in either categorical or in continuous units. it is very important to understand these scales of measurement so that you can assess the quality of an instrument and you can determine an appropriate technique, an appropriate statistic that you can use in the data analysis. So for you to do a good data analysis, then you have to consider what scale of measurement you are using. So we have two broad categories of units under which we have these scales. For example, under categorical units, we have nominal scales. Nominal scales, in nominal scales, what researchers do, researchers use nominal scales to provide response options where participants can check one or more categories that describe their traits or describe their attributes or describe their characteristics. So we use nominal scales to provide response options. Where this participant check, are you a male or female? Then a participant can check whether he is a male or a female. These scales actually do not have any order. For example, we are talking about gender. Gender can be divided into two categories, let's say male and female, as we have said, and there is no kind of ordering in any gender. But we have another measurement of scale that we call it ordinal, where researchers use these ordinal scales, or in other books they write as ranking scales. Researchers use these kind of measurements to provide response options where participants provide a kind of rank from the best or from the most important to the worst or to the least important of some trait or of some attribute or some characteristics. These scales have a kind of implied intrinsic order. For example, performance in a race for runners, they can be from the first to the last. So there is a kind of order of importance. We have another group or units, we call it continuous units. Here we have interval scales and we have ratio scales. Speaking of interval scales or rating scales, they provide continuous response options to questions with assumed equal distance between the options. These scales may have 3 or 4 options. And the most popular Likert scales that fall under interval scales are those questions where participant is asked to select from strongly agree to strongly disagree. We have another measurement of scale that we call it ratio or a true zero scale. A true zero scale. This is a response scale in which participants check a response option with the true zero and equal distances between units. An example of ratio scale, can be a height of individual. So thank you very much for following Elimika Mtandaoni. In this episode, we have explained about the process of data collection in the quantitative approach. In the next episode, we will discuss how now we can do analysis of these quantitative data. So thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe, share with others, like, comment. If you have any question, ask me there. I will answer that question. Thank you very much. My name is Agustino Mogosi and you are listening and you are watching Elimika Mtandaoni. Thank you.